Lightning stitched the midnight over Ashford as Evan Cole stumbled into St. Aurelius Chapel, clutching his chest, and the candle flames skittered like frightened birds across wet stone. Dr. Lucas Perez burst from the clinic door and said, "Don't move him," while a portable monitor rattled over old tiles. Sister Margaret Hale knelt and said, "Stay with me, son," and Ruth Carter whispered, "Please not again," as thunder pressed the roof down. The screen flattened to a dead line, and Evan said, "If anyone's listening, I can't carry this anymore," tasting copper and rain. A presence gathered at the altar, warm as sunrise and wordless, and a figure stepped forward like light, remembering a body. Ruth said, "That's the saint from my dream." And Dr. Perez snapped, "Adrenaline? Electricity, not fantasy," gripping the cart. The luminous hand hovered over Evan's sternum, and heat spilled through his ribs like a bell struck once. The monitor chirped a stubborn rhythm, and Sister Margaret laughed through tears and said, "Mercy can look like science." A darker thing, the pall recoiled into the corner, and Evan opened his eyes, seeing the impossible. He said, "What are you?" And the answer arrived inside him as steady breath. "You are not finished." Rain ticked like nails on the stained glass, while Evan sat propped against a pew, trying to believe the air still belonged to him. Dr. Perez said, "Adrenaline spike, vagal snapback, nothing mystical, planting facts like barricades." Sister Margaret said, "Mercy wears many costumes," and tucked a folded cloth beneath Evan's head. Ruth touched his sleeve and said, "You asked for help," and help answered, eyes flicking to the dark corner. Evan said, "Something else was here," and the word unfinished beat under his sternum like a second pulse. He remembered the ambulance boy with the baseball cap and the silence that followed. "I quit," he said, but the ache didn't. Sister Margaret said, "Grief is not a jail, it is a path if you walk it." Dr. Perez sighed and said, "I'll run labs if you show up." Evan stared into the shadow pooling near the altar and felt both fear and invitation. At the clinic threshold, the bell rope still swayed like a nervous habit the storm had taught it. Dr. Perez said, "Come next week for a full workup," and offered a card with tired authority. Evan said, "I haven't been a patient since I quit the rig," rubbing the ridge of an old scar. Ruth tucked a blanket around his shoulders and said, "Quitting isn't healing." Sister Margaret touched the steadying monitor and said, "There is a story in that rhythm." Thunder wandered off like a grudge, losing momentum, and the emergency lights mellowed into gold. Evan looked at the door, imagining hospital corridors like long mirrors. "If tonight is a second chance," he said, "what does it want from me?" Ruth said, "Maybe just honesty." Dr. Perez said, "And compliance." The bell rope stilled as if the room had made up its mind. Under the dripping eaves, the street hissed with fresh rain and diner neon jittered in puddles. Evan said, "When I lost that kid, I told God to lose me too," voice thin as steam. Sister Margaret said, "You can't outrun a love that isn't keeping score," eyes kind but unblinking. A transformer popped, and the town lights limped back to life in reluctant rows. Ruth said, "If tonight opens a door, will you step through it?" Dr. Perez checked his watch and said, "Step, but bring data." Evan stared at a puddle where the pall's reflection shivered, then vanished like a lie that forgot its script. The word unfinished returned, less threat and more summons. "I don't know how," he said. Sister Margaret said, "One honest breath at a time." Rain softened to a whisper, like the town exhaling. Evan's phone buzzed like a trapped fly, and a thin voice said, "Mr. Cole, my nephew Noah is at St. Gabriel's. They say there's nothing left to do." Ruth froze because the name belonged to her. Dr. Perez said, "I'm on call. I'll meet you there," already turning back toward the clinic corridor. Sister Margaret closed her eyes and said, "Sometimes the door opens twice in one night," fingers brushing her rosary. Evan felt unfinished become direction, like a compass waking. "I'm coming," he said, and fear tasted metallic while hope tasted bright. Ruth said, "We stand together." Dr. Perez said, "No promises, only work." Sister Margaret said, "And prayer as labor." The rain thinned to threads, and the candle near the door straightened its flame as if the room itself agreed. St. Gabriel Medical Center breathed bleach, coffee, and humming vents as the sliding doors sighed open. Evan flinched at the smell because it carried every siren he had tried to forget. Dr. Lucas Perez said, "Noah Carter, pediatric ICU," and his voice clicked into protocol. Ruth Carter said, "He's 10, and the number felt like a held breath between them. Sister Margaret Hale said, "Grief can be a guide if you let it walk beside you." Evan said, "The last boy I held was 10, and the lobby turned into a hallway of ghosts." A janitor's radio crackled a hymn by mistake, and the tune sounded embarrassed to be holy. Thunder rolled far off like a tired drumline circling the town. Dr. Perez said, "We move, we assess, we support," and pushed through a badge-locked door. Ruth said, "We love," and her hands shook, but her eyes were steel. Sister Margaret said, "Courage first, explanations later," and smiled like a lit match. Evan followed, heart tapping a skittish rhythm that still felt borrowed from that light. Somewhere a code alarm tested its speaker, and the sound threaded memory to the present. He said, "Unfinished," under his breath, and the word fit like a key finally turning. PICU monitors whispered in green lines, while Noah lay small beneath a forest of tubing. Ruth said, "Hey, warrior," and her thumb traced a circle on his knuckles. Dr. Perez said, "Viral myocarditis. We're supporting while the heart decides." Sister Margaret said, "Sometimes breath waits for permission." Evan said, "Kid, if you hear me, I know this drum," and his voice softened like gauze. The room smelled of plastic, saline, and freshly scrubbed hope. Rain stitched light across the blinds in trembling bars. Dr. Perez adjusted drips and said, "We guard the organs and watch the trend." Ruth said, "He's stubborn like his mama." Evan remembered a cap with the team logo, and a silence that never stopped ringing. Sister Margaret moved one chair closer and said, "We will not stand far away." Noah's finger twitched like a secret handshake from sleep. Evan breathed with him, counting seconds that wanted to matter. Dr. Perez said, "What happened in the chapel doesn't revise protocols," and the words landed like clamps. Evan said, "I'm not asking for magic, just meaning that doesn't quit." Ruth said, "Meaning kept me sober when medicine kept me alive." Sister Margaret said, "God made nerves for questions." The monitor skipped into a brief messy run, and then settled, like the room itself changed its mind. Dr. Perez said, "Artifacts happen," but his eyes lingered on the waveform. Evan said, "Fear taught me silence, tonight is teaching me breath." Ruth said, "Then we breathe together, and we do the work." Sister Margaret said, "Doubt is not a villain when it sits at the table." The air felt charged but not hostile, as if honesty found an outlet. Dr. Perez said, "I will document everything," and the admission surprised him. Evan touched the rail and said, "I will stay," and the promise steadied the floor. In the hallway, a framed photo showed the courtyard statue, face lifted like someone listening. Evan said, "That's him," and the chill on his neck felt almost kind. A maintenance worker said, "Old Saint Aurelius, patron of stubborn hearts." Sister Margaret said, "We kept the courtyard when they built the new wing." Evan said, "He touched me, or I touched the part of me that wasn't done." Dr. Perez said, "Images comfort, but medicine changes outcomes." The elevator chimed with a modest little bell that refused to boast. Rain clicked against the glass and the sky kept its secrets. Sister Margaret said, "Both can be true if truth is bigger than our boxes." Evan watched the halo in the print and felt less alone in the corridor. Dr. Perez stared longer than he meant to, and said nothing. The doors slid open like a polite invitation to choose. Back in the room, Ruth told Noah about a boy with a lantern who walked through storms without running. Evan said, "Lanterns only work if you're brave enough to look." Dr. Perez said, "We may need to discuss ECMO if support fails." Ruth said, "Discuss, but don't count him out before he speaks." Sister Margaret turned the blinds and let the courtyard silhouette fall across Noah's chest. The shadow crossed him like a map of future streets. Evan said, "I have been lost and asked to be lost." Sister Margaret said, "You were heard anyway." Dr. Perez said, "I will fight for him with everything I can measure." Ruth said, "And I'll fight with what can't be grasped." Noah's breath evened as if he liked this argument. Evan touched the blanket and felt his fear answer to its better name. Dawn seeped into the hospital like a pale apology, spilling between blinds into the quiet waiting area where Evan sat with coffee cooling in his hands. He said, "If faith is real, it can handle my anger," staring at the ripples. The pall, thin as smoke, slid across the ceiling tiles and whispered without sound, "Give him up, you fail boys." Sister Margaret walked in with a paper bag of muffins and said, "E8, even prophets need breakfast." He smirked, "Not a prophet, just a man who's been warned twice." The coffee was bitter, but not as bitter as last night's fear. Dr. Perez appeared, scanning his tablet and said, "Vitals steady for now, but don't get comfortable." Evan said, "I'm not here for comfort." Rain tapped a slow hymn on the window, and the smell of bleach sat heavy over the room. Sister Margaret said, "Even when the light comes in softly, it's still light," and her tone made it impossible not to believe for a moment. Evan looked up at the ceiling corner. The pall was gone. In a glass-walled conference room, Dr. Perez said, "We're at a threshold. Medically we can support, but the heart must rally or not." Ruth leaned forward and said, "He's rallied before." Evan asked, "What happens if we stand still together?" Dr. Perez blinked, caught by the oddness of the question, then said, "We monitor." Sister Margaret traced a cross into condensation on the glass and said, "Thresholds are where miracles hide as coincidences." Outside, nurses rolled cots past, their wheels squeaking like small alarms. Evan stared through the glass at the hallway's curve, as if it might deliver answers in a wheelchair. Ruth said, "We're not moving until we know where he's going." Dr. Perez nodded. "I can work with that," which for him was as close as agreement came. Then a nurse stuck her head in and said, "He's waking." Noah's eyelids fluttered, and he whispered, "A lady in light told me to breathe slower." Ruth covered her mouth, tears slipping through her fingers. Dr. Perez said, "Hallucinations happen in recovery." Evan leaned closer. "What else did she say?" Noah frowned in concentration. She said, "Tell the man with the broken metronome that the rhythm isn't punishment, it's invitation." Evan froze. His chest thudded once, heavy and unsteady. Sister Margaret said softly, "Messages have strange carriers." Ruth brushed Noah's hair back and said, "You scared me, warrior." Dr. Perez scribbled on his clipboard, his face somewhere between skepticism and curiosity. Evan's grip on the bedrail tightened, not in fear but in recognition. Ruth stepped into the hallway to call family, and the Paul leaned from the elevator alcove, whispering across Evan's mind, "You failed the last boy. Why risk this one?" Sister Margaret walked straight into that chill and said, "Doubt your breath smells like old fear." Evan said, "If I pray, I want it to be honest." Dr. Perez passed with a clipboard and said, "Honest is good, just be consistent." The elevator doors began to close, and the Pauls formed thinned like smoke. Ruth returned, phone still in hand, and said, "They're on their way." Evan said, "Then we hold the line." The hallway felt warmer than it should have, and for once Evan didn't check the ceiling for shadows. In the courtyard, noon sunlight painted St. Aurelius in gold. Evan said, "If you're a messenger, send me." Sister Margaret said, "Be careful with vows. The sky takes them seriously." He placed his palm on the statue's cold chest, remembering the heat in the chapel. "I'm afraid of being wrong," he admitted. Wind moved the prayer, ribbons tied to the railings like applause, too gentle to interrupt. Sister Margaret said, "Fear is part of the currency." Evan looked at the marble eyes, and for a second, they seemed to look back. Dr. Perez called from the door, "Rounds are starting." Evan nodded, still touching stone, feeling his heartbeat match the weight under his hand. "Not finished," he whispered. Evening bruised the sky violet when Dr. Perez stepped in, eyes sharper than the monitors, and said, "Noah's rhythm is unstable again." Ruth gripped the bedrail. "Well, stand." Evan felt unfinished, turn urgent in his bones. Sister Margaret said, "Bring the lantern," meaning the small brass vigil lamp from her bag. Dr. Perez hesitated. "Hospital policy, fine, keep it away from oxygen." The little flame caught, throwing warm gold over cold green monitor light. Evan sat beside Noah, matching his breaths to the machine's hesitant beat. Rain whispered on the glass like quiet applause no one else could hear. Ruth said, "This isn't the end," more to herself than anyone. Dr. Perez murmured, "It better not be." Sister Margaret touched the lamp and said, "Light doesn't ask permission to shine." Evan thought, "Neither does love," and the thought steadied his shaking hands. Alarms flirted with panic, and in the far corner, the divine messenger stood like light bent into human shape. Its voice was inside them, "Be not afraid of the test that reveals you." Noah's eyelids flickered. Evan whispered, "Tell me what to do." "Lift the boy's name higher than your fear," the messenger replied. Ruth took Noah's hand, whispering his name. Dr. Perez glanced at the monitors, perfect symmetry for 3 impossible seconds, before shaking his head. Sister Margaret, eyes wet, whispered, "I see you." Rain pulsed heavier against the window as if keeping time. Evan inhaled deeply, the words unfinished and invitation melting together. He could feel the messenger's gaze, not on his face, but in the steadying rhythm beneath his ribs. Ruth reached across the bed, took Evan's hand, and said, "Say his name." Together they breathed, "Noah." Dr. Perez muttered, "Names don't change ejection fractions." The messenger's voice rapped the moment. "Love does." Noah's chest rose in a calmer rhythm. Not healed, not yet, but no longer frantic. Sister Margaret smiled through tears. "There, see how the storm listens." Evan felt a shift inside himself, like a metronome finally syncing with the music instead of fighting it. Ruth leaned down and pressed her forehead to Noah's. Dr. Perez glanced at the monitor again and stayed silent. Outside, lightning stitched a single white thread through the night. Later in the dim family lounge, Sister Margaret said, "I once lost faith after my brother died, kept the habit, lost the hope." Evan said, "So the faithful guide wasn't always." She smiled. "Guides are just practiced wanderers." The pall pressed its cold face against the lounge window, whispering, "He will die, and you will break again." Dr. Perez entered with lab results. "There's a slight, inexplicable improvement." Ruth, half rising, said, "Say that again slowly." He repeated it, and it felt heavier the second time. Evan stared at the shadow until it slid away. Sister Margaret sipped coffee like it was communion. The hum of the vending machine filled the pause that followed. The twist came in the records room, under flickering fluorescence. Dr. Perez held a file and said, "This match, it's preliminary, but the donor is from tonight's accident case." Evan's eyes narrowed. "The boy I lost?" Perez nodded. Ruth gripped the counter. "My nephew might live because your heartbreak learned another language." Sister Margaret said, "This is the circle nobody expects until it closes." Evan felt dizzy, as if the room had tilted toward something both merciful and cruel. Rain drummed harder on the high windows, an uninvited witness. Dr. Perez said, "If the cross-match holds, surgery by dawn." Ruth whispered, "Then dawn can't come fast enough." Before dawn, the storm returned like an argument. The sky refused to drop. The transport team radioed delays. Noah's numbers slipped, soft at first, then sharper. The pall coiled in the doorway, tasting panic. The messenger hovered by the window, patient as sunrise. Evan asked, "If the match fails, will faith look like foolishness?" Dr. Perez, without sarcasm, said, "If it fails, it will still have been love." Ruth leaned close to Noah, whispering, "You are not a ledger." Sister Margaret set the vigil lamp near the glass. "Light meets light," she murmured. Rainwater streaked like tears down the pane. Evan's pulse was a drum in his ears. The room smelled of ozone and antiseptic. Dr. Perez checked his watch, muttering about minutes that might matter more than skill. Ruth straightened and said, "Then we will give everyone." The messenger's glow brightened fractionally, as if in agreement. The monitors faltered, then caught again, then dropped. Backup power clicked over with a groan. The call finally came, the donor heart lost to logistics. Dr. Perez's jaw set. "I'm sorry." Ruth bowed her forehead to Noah's hand. "Then we will not give him up." Evan lifted his face like offering himself to a lightning strike. "Teach me." The messenger's voice, not to bargain, but to belong. The pall grinned in the corner, dark as wet ink. Sister Margaret stood between it and the bed, shoulders squared. Rain hammered harder, beating a rhythm older than language. Dr. Perez said, "We keep supporting." Evan said, "Then I'll keep breathing with him." Ruth whispered, "And I with you." For a heartbeat, the shadow paused, as though it had heard something it didn't understand. Evan walked into the small hospital chapel. "St. Aurelius," he said, "if you're just the shape I give my hope, fine. I'll take the shape." Sister Margaret leaned in the doorway. "Faith isn't the candle, it's the courage to strike the match." He said, "Then hold my hand while I do." Together, they lit a small taper and named Noah aloud. Then the boy Evan had lost. The names hung in the air like suspended bells. Warm light filled the space, a counterpoint to the storm's cold. Evan felt a loosening in his chest, like some part of his heart had stepped forward instead of hiding. Sister Margaret whispered a prayer too old to trace. Outside, thunder softened into rain's lullaby. The candle flame swayed once, then steadied. Back in the PICU, Noah stirred. "Did you bring the lantern?" Ruth laughed through her tears. "It's here." Dr. Perez scrolled through scans, frowning. "Inflammation markers are down," he admitted. The pall hissed, "Coincidence?" The messenger replied, "Providence in timing's disguise." Evan pressed his hand over his own chest, feeling a steadier beat. Sister Margaret adjusted the lamp's position. "Light where it can be seen," she said. Rainlight streaked across the monitor's glass. Ruth whispered, "You keep surprising us, warrior." Noah's eyes half opened, and his lips curved in a faint smile. The storm roared, and the city blinked out. Generators coughed to life, except in the PICU, where a breaker tripped. Alarms screamed. The pall swelled in delight. Dr. Perez barked, "Bag him, manual ventilation." Evan stepped forward. "Let me." Ruth steadied his wrists. "Breathe with him." Sister Margaret began humming an old hymn, low and steady. The messenger's glow flared, spilling over the bed. Evan squeezed the bag in rhythm, his heartbeat sensing to Noah's breaths. The room felt like a battlefield with no weapons but lungs and light. The pall lunged once, then recoiled under the pressure of that strange harmony. Rain pounded like marching feet, but inside every motion was slow, deliberate, unyielding. In the blackout silvered dark, Evan's hands found rhythm with Noah's breaths. "In, hold, out," he murmured, each squeeze of the bag a vow. The messenger said, "Let the breath know it is welcome." The pall hissed, "You will tire and fail him." Dr. Perez leaned in, counting like a drummer, stethoscope pressed to Noah's chest. Ruth's voice anchored them, "You are not alone." Sister Margaret moved like a battlefield nurse, keeping cords clear and lines from tangling. Rain struck the glass in sheets, each impact a reminder that time wasn't stopping. Evan's forearms burned, but the steady lift of Noah's chest was worth every ache. The messenger's glow brightened, throwing long defiant shadows against the wall. For the first time tonight, Evan didn't feel chased. He felt chosen. The breaker snapped with a metallic pop. Lights surged, monitors blinked awake, and the maintenance tech outside the window gave a casual thumbs up. Evan's eyes went to the screen. Noah's rhythm was smoother than before the outage. "No," Dr. Perez muttered. "That's not how this works." Evan said, "Maybe tonight it is." Ruth pressed her forehead to Noah's. "You stubborn, shining kid." Sister Margaret simply smiled, the expression of someone who's seen doors open in walls that weren't supposed to move. Rain slowed to a steady patter, softer now. The pall thinned, curling into the baseboard's shadow, starved by the warmth in the room. Evan's chest felt lighter, as though carrying less gravity. The messenger's gaze moved from Noah to Evan, and lingered. The messenger's voice came clear. "Your heart, too." Heat spread through Evan's chest like dawn over frost. His arrhythmia, the constant flutter, eased into a steady, unbroken rhythm. He bowed, tears cutting warm paths down his face. "Why me?" The messenger replied, "Because you asked without bargaining." Dr. Perez's eyes darted from Noah's monitor to Evan's steady hands. "I can document that," he said, almost reverent. Sister Margaret laughed softly. "Miracles do love a paper trail." Ruth caught Evan's eye, and for once he didn't look away. The air felt new, like the first breath after a long-held dive. Outside, the storm was breaking. The pall gathered itself for one final rush, whispering, "If he lives, you will owe everything." Evan said, "I owe everything anyway." Ruth stepped forward. "Debt isn't the language of love." Dr. Perez's voice steadied. "Let's wean support, he's meeting the moment." Sister Margaret set the vigil lamp at the foot of the bed, a boundary line of light. The pall faltered, folding inward, until it was no more than a smudge in the corner, like fear out of a job. Noah's breaths came easier, his face softer in sleep. Evan exhaled, his own heartbeat steady as the monitors. Rain had become a memory on the window. Noah's eyes opened, clearer than before. The lady said, "Don't be brave alone," he whispered to Evan. Evan laughed through tears. "Deal." Dr. Perez leaned against the window, shaking his head. "I'll be publishing a cautiously worded letter to the impossible." Sister Margaret said, "Spell it Love." Ruth gathered Noah into her arms, the safest place in the room. Outside, dawn pressed gold into the horizon. The monitors hummed their steady chorus. Evan stood beside them, not as a savior, not as a ghost, but as someone who finally understood the rhythm was an invitation, not a punishment. 1 week later, sunlight poured through St. Aurelius Chapel as Evan stood where he had fallen. "I didn't earn this," he said quietly. Sister Margaret answered, "Gifts aren't wages." Dr. Perez, in a shirt and tie instead of scrubs, lingered near the doorway. "I can't explain any of it without breaking my own rules," he admitted. Ruth knelt at the altar, lighting the brass lantern again. "Then let's not explain," she said. "Let's live grateful." The messenger was not visible, yet the air near the candle shimmered with warmth. Evan exhaled, the word, unfinished, now feeling like an invitation instead of a burden. The old wood under his boots creaked like it was remembering him. Outside, bells began to ring for the morning service. Evan walked into St. Gabriel's not as a patient, not as a paramedic, but as a volunteer. In the waiting room, a mother asked, "Does prayer help?" Evan knelt beside her. "Prayer helps me love you better while we wait," he said. Dr. Perez, behind the desk, pretended to be absorbed in his charts, but listened closely. Sister Margaret entered with coloring books, handing one to a child in the corner. "Miracles hide in crayons too," she said. Ruth, arriving with coffee for everyone, laughed softly. Evan stayed with the mother until her name was called, then stood to greet the next family. The lobby smelled of coffee and floor polish, but the air felt lighter than before. On rounds, Dr. Perez paused at a window overlooking the courtyard statue. "I'm not converting," he said, "but I am reconsidering what I call impossible." Evan smiled. "I think heaven loves a good skeptic." Sister Margaret added, "Doubt is faith's workout." Ruth's phone chimed. She grinned at a photo of Noah eating waffles. "Miracle status. Sticky," she read aloud. Dr. Perez surprised himself by laughing, a sound not clipped by caution. Outside, prayer ribbons fluttered on the railings, each one catching a bit of sunlight. Evan rested a hand against the window glass, feeling the warmth. The statue seemed to watch them without judgment. That evening, Evan met Ruth by the river, where the town stored its fireworks and regrets. "I used to think healing meant erasing," he said. She answered, "Healing means integrating." The messenger brushed the water's surface with a line of gold. No one else seemed to notice. Beneath the bridge post, the Paul, no bigger than a hand now, watched but said nothing. "I can wait," it whispered. "So can hope," Evan replied. The river took both voices and folded them into its endless patient current. Lights from the opposite bank shimmered like scattered coins. Ruth kicked a stone into the water, breaking the reflection. In the chapel's quiet night, Evan placed the brass lantern at the foot of the cross. "I don't know what you are, Saint, but I know what happened when I stopped bargaining." Sister Margaret said, "Faith is what remains when the deal-making ends." Dr. Perez stood with hands in pockets admitting, "Anecdote or not, I am changed." Ruth slipped a note under the lamp. "We choose love." The messenger's warmth lingered in the wood like sunlight stored for winter. Outside, the bells marked the hour, and the shadow had nowhere left to cling. Evan closed his eyes, not to shut out the world, but to keep it closer.